As the court has said, what I say or what Mr. Tennell says about the evidence is up to you and to you only for determination. In a criminal proceeding, the prosecution can address you twice since they have the burden of proof. Defense can address you as a jury once. And before proceeding any further, my co-counsel, the defendant, and myself, thank you all for your service as jurors and for the sacrifice you make in serving as such. This trial has been an extended process, as you well know. By my count, there were 51 witnesses called by the state, and I believe over 300 exhibits admitted into evidence. You also heard the voice of Shawn Grate when he was interviewed by Detective Dorsey early in the morning of September 13th of 2016, and then by Detective Lay not too long after Dorsey's interview. Then there was another interview by Detective Major on September the 13th of 2016, starting at 10:53 a.m. in the morning. Not too much after Shawn is taken into custody by the officers, and particularly Detective Dorsey. There's another interview starting by 12:24 p.m. involving Detective Major and Shawn Grate. Another one at 1:38. Another one at 14:29, again by Major. And then on September 15th, there was another interview by Major and Detective Evans. There was another interview September 27th, another one October 4th, and another one, I believe the last was October the 5th. Those last ones, again, being conducted by Detective Major. You also heard Shawn's voice via a DVD or a CD presented by Lieutenant Eisenhower. Bear in mind that Shawn didn't, quote unquote, lawyer up, as they say on television. He freely, voluntarily gave statements, interviews, drew maps, accompanying officers to sites where he had stayed, leaving stolen property and property of his behind, and sites of breaking and enterings and burglaries. In Shawn's first interview with Detective Dorsey, he tells Dorsey certain things involving the case of Lori Shivik. After that, he is released into the custody of Detective Lay, and he and Detective Lay again talk about things that have gone on. During the time that he is talking to Detective Lay, the conversation turns to Elizabeth. During the time that he is talking to Detective Lay, Shawn tells Detective Lay, or there's a question that comes up about Elizabeth. And Detective Lay asks him to give a description of Elizabeth just so he can ascertain whether Shawn knows Elizabeth Griffith. Shawn admits that he knows who she is. He gives a physical description of her. After more discussion about Elizabeth, he says to Lay, she's set free. No more problems. She don't have to cry anymore. Then Detective Lay asks, how did you set her free? And the answer was kind of different, as you heard in the prosecutor's closing statement. Shawn's response was, because she jumped on my back. Detective's next question was, what happened? And Shawn's answer was, she kept crying to me. She did say, yeah, it's what you make of this world and everything, and she wished she could just die. Questioned by Lay, what happened? And Shawn's response was, when I think about it, I just don't know what happens sometimes. Lay responds that they can work through that. Just for now, tell me where she's at. And Shawn answers, I gave up my life a long time ago to help people do things that they can't do themselves. Shawn has now admitted to Lay some contact with Elizabeth Griffith. After that interview, he is handed off to Detective Major. At that point, no bodies have been found, and Shawn begins his first interview with Detective Major at about 10:53 a.m. on September the 13th, 2016, later in the morning after he was taken into custody. Starting with exhibit number 282, Shawn talks with Detective Major, which talks continue on through September into October, and those talks or those interviews between Major and Shawn are represented in State's Exhibit 280 and 17 more exhibits after Exhibit 280. In these exhibits, Shawn implicated himself in the deaths of Elizabeth and Stacy early on September the 13th, and again before the bodies are found. As you'll recall, Detective Major testified that once he said it, she called and advised the searchers at the covert court address that the bodies are there, and she told them where they were located. Throughout the continuing interviews, he tells of videos, he tells of sex objects and sex toys that you've heard about, the fact that no DNA on any of those items except his own, and he answers most, if not all, of the questions asked by Detective Majors, or by law enforcement for that matter, most of which answered were verified by law enforcement investigators. In reference to the indictment in count 1, charges Shawn with aggravated murder for purposely and with prior calculation and design causing the death of Elizabeth Griffith. Listen closely to the court's instruction of prior calculation and design, and look at the before and the after the death to determine prior calculation and to determine design. As to specification number 1 to count 1, where is the evidence that the death of Elizabeth is in any manner or form connected with the death of Stacy, other than each is a female and each died of cervical compression? As to specification 2 of count 1, Elizabeth was not kidnapped. She came to the covert court address on and out of her own volition and entered the home on and out of her own volition. Her death occurred without a kidnapping or attempt to kidnap or attempt to commit kidnapping, or during one's fleeing immediately after committing or attempting to commit kidnapping. As to count 2, the same argument applies as in count 1, in that Elizabeth's death did not occur while Shawn was committing, attempting to commit, or fleeing immediately after committing, or attempting to commit kidnapping. As to count 2, the same argument applies as to count 2 in the specifications as was set forth in count 1. As to count 3, the same arguments of part of the defense are set forth in count 1 and count 2, and they apply to count 3. As to count 7, Stacy gave Shawn a ride to the covert court address. She went into the residence again of her own volition. They supposedly kissed, made out, and there's no evidence there was a real plan as to how to dispose of the body or to flee the scene. Consider again the before and after when you talk about or discuss prior calculation and design. As to specification 1 of count 7, there is no evidence proving again a course of conduct other than the 2 victims were women, females, and each died as a result of cervical compression. As to specification 2 of count 7, there was no kidnapping or attempt to commit kidnapping, or fleeing immediately after committing kidnapping, or attempting to commit kidnapping, and or rape and or aggravated robbery, as Stacy's death occurred after the rape was over and complete. There could be no aggravated robbery due to any theft offense occurring after her death. As to count 8 and the specifications, the same argument is made in count 7, and specifications apply. As to count 9, Shawn did not, by force or stealth or deception, remove Stacy from any place. She voluntarily again and freely came to and entered the defendant's residence at Covert Court of her own and remained there. Her death did not occur until after the rape was over, and she maced Shawn as she was leaving. Her death did not occur during any kidnapping or while the rape was in progress. Same argument applies to count 10. As to count 11, the sexual conduct did not occur by force or threat or force, as consensual sex had been going on before. As to count number 12, Shawn did not inflict or attempt to inflict serious physical harm upon Stacy in attempting or committing a theft offense or in fleeing immediately after the attempt or offense, as Stacy was a deceased person when any theft of her property occurred by Shawn. I ask that you consider all the evidence admitted carefully and completely, and consider that Shawn freely and voluntarily gave information during several interviews which implicated himself in several serious offenses. Detective Major, several times in her interviews during the 18 exhibits and the DVDs that go with those exhibits, said several times in her interviews with Shawn, she described him as a person with a conscience, as a stand-up guy who admitted his transgressions when he was wrong, and an honest person in his interviews. My co-counsel, myself, and Shawn know fully well that Shawn will not walk out of this courtroom a free man. We ask for a fair and impartial verdict based upon the law and the evidence as you and each of you determine it to be. Thank you again for your consideration. Appreciate it. Thank you, Judge.